like to keep things nice and relaxed, folks, and try and make these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions, and I hope you have got questions, then we'll leave plenty of time for that. Equally, if you want to ask a question, stick your hand up and we'll bring you in. So performance nutrition, or introduction of performance nutrition, is what we're talking about tonight. And obviously nutrition is a massive area, and it's fraught with problems. Problems largely because we think about food for pleasure, quite rightly. There's nothing nicer than having a really good meal. I think everybody thinks they know about nutrition and what's required and what is a healthy diet. And thirdly, and I think most importantly with athletes, is you don't realize the difference it can make, good nutrition can make, until you've actually experienced it. And certainly with the players that I work with, we've noticed, or I've noticed, that there is often a light bulb moment. There is often a breakthrough moment when the athlete realizes just what a difference can be made when they get their nutrition right and they think in terms of performance. And I remember it was a few years ago now at a tournament in Pavua, where I went along to work particularly with one athlete on this topic, who'd always been fading at the end of the day and at the end of the competition. And on this occasion, we got the nutrition right. He made the podium, but of course he was reporting back that he just felt completely different. He had more energy than he'd ever had before. His decision making was better, because we know that that's a big part of nutrition. Your decision making was there. And that was the light bulb moment for him. And then he talked to other players, and we started to get people working on the right kind of lines. So the problems with nutrition are those that it just takes that moment to get into it and to work it through. So I thought what we do tonight is look at some of the key concepts, and then develop them and develop that little bit of understanding. I've done a note sheet which Nat will send out later, and the note sheet will also, it acts as a reminder, as a pointer for certain things we're talking about, but also an opportunity for you to make your own notes against these the points. And then if you're interested in taking it further, do some more research and get involved and get interested in the subject area. And I think you'll find that a very useful approach, given that as coaches, you're highly unlikely to have given to you a specialist nutritionist. So you need some knowledge to work with your athletes, a bit like you do in strength and conditioning, to be able to work with them and to help them along the way. So some knowledge in that regard is particularly useful, I think. So the way I approach this is to try and get athletes to think about the concept of eating, not so much as pleasure, but as function. And for the time that they are athletes, their primary concern is, how best can I fuel my body to facilitate performance? And the big change is that we think about getting maximum quality from every mouthful and every calorie that we put into our bodies. So if you have a packet of crisps and a Mars bar, that will fill you up. That will satisfy your need. It will make you feel full. But in terms of nutrients for your body, it will do very little for your body. So all the things that an athlete needs to do will not be fulfilled by a packet of crisps and a Mars bar, but it will be if you eat other kinds of food. So it's that kind of approach that I've found useful with athletes. And it's not to say that understanding what healthy lifestyle and healthy eating is important. Of course it is. The whole business about a balanced diet, about more fruit and veg and all that, it's all really important. But we're not going to cover that today. We're going to focus in on the competition side of things, the performance side of things, and we're going to get down to the performance day and the performance week. So we'll get really quite specific in that regard. So what's the maximum quality you can get into your body with every mouthful for each athlete? And then how does each food affect my performance? What does it actually do to my body to affect my performance? Those are the two key concepts. and key questions that we want to start with. So if we look at the three macronutrients that you're all familiar with, protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And let's just start by understanding what they do for our bodies when we eat them. Now, all foods usually contain a balance of those three, and some have got more protein, some have got more carbohydrate, some foods have got more fat, but most foods contain all of those things. But foods that are high in protein, they're particularly responsible for rebuilding and repairing. So they're very important in recovery from a session. So let's say one of your athletes has done a hand bike session or a TheraBand session, a physical session, then that exercise will have broken down muscle tissue. Because whenever we exercise, we break down muscle tissue, we damage it effectively, and then when we rest, that tissue repairs and recovers stronger for the next time. And then when we do it again, the same process happens. And this is called adaptation. So we get stronger, or we get better cardiovascular endurance, or we get more flexible because we do damage, the body repairs to get stronger, and we then progress in that way. So the protein element in food is what facilitates optimally that development of repair and regeneration. So protein foods are very important in our diet from that point of view. The other thing that protein foods do, or foods which are high in protein, is they slow down the absorption of calories. They slow down the absorption of calories. So that means the calories trickle into your bloodstream. They don't rush into your bloodstream. So that's an important thing. And we call these slow release foods. So they're sustaining foods that can last for an awful long time. And I'll come back to this in a moment. So protein is very important. However, and this is a key thing we must always remember, if you eat too much protein, the extra protein that you don't need is stored as fat. So big asterisk next to that point. So if we eat too much protein that we cannot use to repair and rejuvenate, we'll store that protein as fat. All right. Now, the typical athlete, one of our athletes, can only absorb 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. So let's say you weigh 70 kilos. You can only absorb 700 grams of protein per day. So it's relatively small amount. And yet you'll see in all sorts of fitness forums, people saying, eat more protein, eat more protein, eat more protein. And protein is very important, as I've just explained, but eat too much of it, and all you'll be doing is you'll be storing it as fat. So we have to be careful. We want enough protein, but we don't want too much protein. So that's what protein does. The second macronutrient, carbohydrate, is where we get our energy. Now, all carbohydrates are sugars, all of them. The difference between the different carbohydrates is how the sugars are bonded and put together. And that means that some of them are released quickly into the bloodstream, so sucrose, straight sugar, the sort of thing you get in a Coca-Cola, a full-fat Coke, that will be in your bloodstream in minutes. So you drink a can of Coke, whoosh, in it goes there. But if you have a more complex pattern of carbohydrates, for example, what you get from porridge, then those carbohydrates will trickle into your bloodstream in the hours that follow the meal. But carbohydrates are there for energy. We need them for energy. Okay. Now, in terms of the carbohydrate process, we store carbohydrate mainly in muscle, and it's stored as glycogen, something called glycogen, muscle glycogen. But we can only store about 2,000 calories worth of glycogen in our muscles. So that's quite a limited amount. Now, I know you'll have all heard of people who are running marathons and they talk about hitting the wall. Well, it's because they're running a marathon at quite a fast pace for them, and they're using up their glycogen as the primary source of fuel. And after about an hour and a half to 2 hours, that 2000 calorie store is pretty much depleted. So there's no more energy left. So they hit the wall. And that's a problem with carbohydrate. We can only store a certain amount of it. So therefore, if we can protect that store and save that store for when we do need it, that's a thing we need to think about as an athlete. Now, in Boccia terms, clearly we need energy for the conditioning that we do, for the match play that we do, but in particular, and we mustn't forget this, for brain power, because your decision making is very much facilitated by glucose to the brain. So that's an important bit of information. The other bit of information is that the brain can only live off glucose. It cannot live off protein. It cannot live off fat. It can only live off glucose. So what we don't want is a situation where our players are low in glucose, so their brain function is impaired when they're making important decisions about tactical situations or what shot to play or whatever. And again, I'll come back to that. Now, the last thing about carbohydrate is if you eat too many carbohydrates in any one day, they will be stored as fat. So like too much protein, too much carbohydrate will be stored as fat. And you've probably heard in the press, carbs getting a really bad deal. People saying, oh, I'm on a low carb diet because I want to lose weight. I'm on a ketone diet, which is basically a high protein diet because I want to lose weight, because it's carbs that are causing the problem. It's not carbs that are causing the problem. It's that people are eating too much of them. Simple as that. So you only need the amount of carbohydrate you need, probably about 800 grams a day, but that's in order for you to survive. But for our athletes, it's where we get our principal energy store from. So that's the second macronutrient. The third macronutrient is fat. Okay. Now, there are different types of fat, and what our athletes need to focus on is what we call the good fats. Now, the good fats are the kind of fats that you get in things like olive oil, in things like oily fish, like tuna and mackerel, in foods like avocado, for example. Those are the good fats. And those are the only fats that we actually need for performance. Now, other fats, as we all know, come from things like biscuits and cake and ice cream and chocolate and all that kind of thing. Very nice, no problem with having a little bit of that. However, for performance, they will contribute nothing. They will contribute nothing. So most of us need to reduce the fat in our diet, but more importantly, we need to think about whatever fats we do eat in our diet are predominantly coming from these good fat sources. Now, we also need to realize that fat is very important in our diet. For one thing, it's responsible for the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins. So you all know vitamins and minerals are really important in our body. Well, you'll get your fat-soluble vitamins from vitamins A, D, E, and K. And the way to remember that is it spells ADEK. ADEK. So your fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, very important to cellular development, cellular health, and they come from the fats that you eat. But they will principally come from the good fats, the oily fish, the olive oil, the avocado, etc. And the reason is that these foods are very high in what are called omega fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. Now, all this detail you don't necessarily need to remember. Just remember that we probably need to eat less fat. Athletes need to eat less fat, but they need to make sure that what they are eating is quality fat. Because what we're trying to get our athletes to do is to think about the quality of every mouthful they put into their bodies, because that's what's going to fuel their performance. So we now know a little bit more about fat, carbohydrate, and protein and how they serve our body when we actually eat them. And that will be useful as we progress through this little session. Another couple of key concepts I'd like to introduce to you, which will be very useful in our overall understanding, are summed up in a little phrase that I use. And the first phrase is eat less. And the second phrase is eat less often. So let me explain what I mean by those phrases. First of all, eat less. It's well known in our society from the research studies that occur that most people eat far too much. They eat far more calories than they actually need. And this is in terms of portion size on a plate on any one meal, but it's also in terms of the day. And when we eat more calories than we need, so when we consume more calories than we burn off, those extra calories are stored as fat. Okay, wherever they come from, protein, carbohydrate, or fat itself, the extra calories will be stored as fat. So if we reduce our portion size so that we match our energy output in the form of Boccia training, strength and conditioning training, stretching, just general living with the food we put in, then we won't encourage our body to store extra fat. Now, this is pretty important because if we think about a Boccia player, by storing extra fat, obviously the person might then be a little bit heavier than they should be. And every single part of their life will be made more difficult because of that. So just think of doing transfers, for example, how hard it is when you're heavy to transfer. But more important than that, think about the load that occurs on the vital organs when they are surrounded by fat. And that becomes very important for health issues. So when we store fat, we store it underneath the skin, and that's obviously what you can see, but we also store it around the vital organs, the heart, the liver, the spleen. And they put stress on those vital organs. They put stress on those vital organs. And that's why in our society, we have an increased problem with heart disease. We have an increased problem with diabetes because we're eating too much generally and we're overloading our system. So that's very important. And for an athlete, of course, that's absolutely critical. We don't want any more stress on our bodies than we actually need. So by eating less, i.e. eating what we need, then we will do ourselves a favor in terms of being a lot healthier. The second part of that little phrase is eat less often. Now, this is a very important concept. If we are encouraged, as we have been, and I've been around a long time, as you could all see, we've been encouraged over the decades to graze, to eat meals very often. And the thinking behind that was that this would give you a constant blood sugar level so that everything would stay nice and even in your body. Unfortunately, with hindsight, what has happened is people have been encouraged to eat very regularly, every few hours, every hour in some people's cases, would you believe? And this means that the overall calorie input of the day is far higher than it actually should be. So what is far better for our bodies, we know now, and I guess we've known for some time, is that you leave long gaps between your meals. So for example, if you have breakfast at 7 o'clock, leave 5 hours or so and don't have lunch until 1 or 2 o'clock. And that means don't snack in between, and be very careful with drinks, because you may not eat food between breakfast and lunch, but if you have 4 or 5 lattes, you're putting an awful lot of calories into your body. So when we think about drinks that, for example, contain milk or contain flavorings and that sort of thing, they're deceptively high in calories. If you drink black coffee, black tea, fruit teas, they've got no calories. If you drink water, there is no calories in water. So my advice would be, have your breakfast by all means, leave a long gap, have your lunch, leave another long gap, and have your evening meal. So go back to the old way, if you like, eating 3 meals a day. Now, what happens when we do that? Well, in the absence of a constant input of calories, largely carbohydrate calories, because we snack on biscuits, don't we? We have a Mars bar, we have a packet of crisps, we maybe have a bit of cake, we have afternoon tea. So in the absence of this snacking, your body has got to get its energy from somewhere. So when the carbohydrate isn't being pumped in through your mouth constantly, your body says, well, where am I going to get this from? I'll take it from this massive store of calories that I have on my body, and that is your fat stores. So it draws the fat from the fat stores around the body and starts to use it as energy. Now, remember something I said earlier, the brain can't live off fat, it can only live off glucose. But the brain is very clever. It will convert the fat that it releases into the system into what are called ketones. You've probably heard of the phrase ketones before. And the ketones are then converted into glucose and the brain is fed. And that's why people can go for months and months and months without eating, provided they've got water. They can go for months and months without eating. The brain can live quite happily because the body adapts by releasing fat from this massive store that we all have. We've all got a big store of fat on our bodies, and it converts it into energy. And the term for this, as far as an athlete is concerned, is becoming fat adapted. Fat adapted. So if you look at the people you see on the telly, some of the long distance runners, they're all fat adapted. They get a lot of their energy whilst they're running from their fat stores. Now ask yourself, so what does that do to my carbohydrate stores? Well, of course, it saves them. So if you're using fat really quite efficiently, you're saving your carbohydrate in your muscles, and you have the carbohydrate readily available for the energy that you need to play your boccia or whatever other sport you're doing. So by leaving long gaps on a regular daily basis, you are training your body to become more fat efficient. You're becoming a fat burning machine. Now, the side effect of this for some people is that they get thinner. They lose a bit of weight, which, most people are quite happy with. But the functional thing is that you become more efficient. You become more efficient. Now, the other side to this is that that's a great thing to happen. But let's say you don't do that. Let's say you continue, as I have to say, the majority of people in this country do, you continue eating regular snacks. Let's just examine what happens when you do that. The big problem we have is we're eating snacks, and they tend to be sugary snacks, and they tend to be sugary drinks. And it's taken me probably 10 years working with Great Britain Boccia to get the athletes off drinking sugary drinks and having snacks. When I first started working with Boccia, I'd go into a training camp and there'd be a table laid out with donuts, crisps, biscuits. And this was in a professional training environment, which wasn't professional at all. But now the athletes don't even think of doing that. We've just finally got that light bulb moment so that that's happened. But most people, and this of course is why we have an obesity problem in our country, most people are eating constantly and regularly. So what happens is this: we eat a snack which is high in sugar, and that sugar goes straight into your bloodstream within minutes. Now, the body's response to this is to secrete a hormone called insulin. You'll have all heard these words knocking about. And this is why I hope it will help to explain them. So we eat the sugar, sugar goes into the bloodstream. The job of insulin, which comes from the pancreas, is to clear out the sugar from the bloodstream so that the blood achieves a homeostasis, a normality. All right. Now, if you were in a wheelchair marathon race, or you're working very hard in the gym and you're taking in a sugary snack, the insulin will send that sugar to your muscles. Your muscles will use that sugar and no problem. Absolutely nice, efficient way of working. However, if you're at rest, if you're as we're all here now, and you put the sugar in, the insulin will clear it out. Where do you suppose it takes it to? Your fat stores. All right. And this is a big thing that athletes don't understand, people don't understand, that we're snacking, we're filling the blood with sugar, insulin's getting rid of that sugar, but it's taking it to the fat stores. So of course we get fatter and fatter and fatter, and that's why we have an obesity problem. So then 2 hours later, you have another sugary stack into the bloodstream, insulin is secreted, takes it off into the fat stores. And this happens all day. And for some people, it's happening all day, every day. So you get sugar high, sugar low, sugar high, sugar low. And that means we'll feel fantastic maybe for 10 minutes, full of energy, maybe for half an hour. But then we'll feel lethargic. Then we'll feel drained. So what do? We eat more sugar. Up we go again. I'm feeling great now. But then I'm feeling lethargic. So what happens with one of your players if they time it wrongly and they start a key game in a tournament when they're in a sugar low? Disaster for boccia players, because the brain power goes, we feel lethargic, we're not in a good state. So this yo-yoing of sugar is a major problem for an athlete. We have to stop that happening if we possibly can. But for long term, of course, what this does, this regular secretion of insulin to control sugar, it desensitizes the insulin. It means that you become less effective in getting out the sugar because the system gets tired. And that's what diabetes is, type 2 diabetes. It's a tired insulin system that cannot cope any longer because you've done this year after year after year, and you now have a major problem. So there are long-term reasons why this makes sense, to leave gaps between meals and to allow your fat metabolism system to do its job and save this sugar problem and sugar dependency. So that's an important piece of information, which I think we can take forward now into the competition day. So if we just go through that and just go through a typical type competition day and see how all these facts I've just given you sort of bring themselves together and come to light. So we get up on competition day, and the first thing we'll probably do is have breakfast. Now, let's think about breakfast. Also think about the state of mind that your athlete is in when they wake up on competition day. They may be anxious, they may be nervous, they may be frightened, they may be excited. They may not want breakfast. That's the first type of athlete. I don't want breakfast. So they miss breakfast, but then they worry about missing breakfast. Oh, I can't play boccia today. I can't possibly function because I haven't had my breakfast. Well, the good news is, provided you've had a decent meal the evening before, your muscle glycogen stores, your muscle carbohydrate stores, what you need, the energy you need to play boccia, do not depreciate. They're the same in the morning as they were the night before. So in actual fact, there is no need to have breakfast. I'm not saying don't have breakfast. I'm just saying there is no need. So if you have an anxious athlete who worries the fact that they're so nervous, they can't stomach anything, That's okay. That's absolutely okay. It's not going to affect their performance. So that can be a very useful information, provided that your athlete knows this, and this is very important, guys, they practice this on a regular weekly basis and on training camps. They see what they're like having not had breakfast, and they realize, actually, I'm okay. I'll get my first game over, then maybe I'll have some breakfast when I've calmed down and I've beaten X player 13-0, and I'm now happy. Now I can eat my breakfast, bring it on. So don't underestimate the role of anxiety in suppressing appetite. So that's one thing about breakfast. The other thing about breakfast is the kind of breakfast I don't need is a fry up. Bacon, eggs, sausage, fried bread. Because not only is that full of processed food, which is high in sugar and salt, in terms of nutrients, it will give the athlete very little of what the athlete needs for that day. But what it will do is overload their system so that they pump sugar into the blood. And what does that do? Causes the insulin response. So insulin also responds to a big meal. And a classic example is fish and chips. Really high calorie meal. If you eat fish and chips, very shortly afterwards, you will feel very lethargic and low because insulin has had to clear out those calories as rapidly as possible. So we certainly don't want a fry up breakfast. What we do want, if we can eat breakfast, is a light breakfast, which is high in carbohydrate, which is slowly released. So for example, porridge, high in carbohydrate, which is slowly released, perhaps some protein, which we might get at breakfast time from nuts and seeds. So if you put chia seeds on your porridge, or flax seeds on your porridge, or have 2 walnuts on top of your porridge, then you're producing a very good carbohydrate meal, which will slowly go into their bloodstream through the morning, through the early games, and not cause an insulin surge and a sugar low. So we want a light breakfast. We don't need to eat a lot, and we need to have the slow release carbohydrate type food. The third thing, some people can eat breakfast, but they really struggle. They might want to get their calories in through a shake or a smoothie. And that's absolutely fine, because there is no difference between solid food and a smoothie in terms of the calories and the nutrients. So if you practice making your own shake, let's say you make it with milk, what you might do is make it with fully skimmed milk, which has all the protein, but none of the fat. Remember, fat is something we don't need at this point. It's protein and carbohydrate. So we might make the shake out of the milk, and then predominantly try and think in terms of vegetables. So you might have spinach or kale in there with some fruit. Be careful of high fruit smoothies, because of course fruit has a lot of natural sugar. And although that will be slowed down by the milk in terms of absorption, you still need to balance it out. So if you can put some banana with some spinach or whatever the combination you like, then experiment with that and play with that in every day of your life and in training camps before you get to competition. So the second way we slow down absorption is to combine foods. So a banana is obviously a very good food, a high source of carbohydrate, but it does actually go into your system quite quickly. So to slow that banana's quality down, we might add some nuts to it. We might add some porridge to it. We might put the banana on a slice of wholemeal bread, because wholemeal bread is very slowly going into the body. So wholemeal bread, much better than white bread, because white bread goes quickly into the body. Why does wholemeal bread go in slowly? Well, it's got all the husks and the grains which need to be digested. It takes a while to do that. So the release is much slower. So combining foods, great, or choosing foods that absorb slowly into the body are what we want at breakfast. And it's a small type meal. Now, just while I'm on the business of shakes, a lot of your athletes will want to buy a protein shake. And that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. However, those of you as coaches who've done your anti-doping training, your UKAD training, will know that supplements are a major source of contamination and can catch athletes out in terms of anti-doping. So if they do buy a supplement, they must make sure that the ingredients are allowed and that the supplement has been batch tested. If you want to avoid that, make your own smoothie, and then you know what's going into it. But if you do want to buy, and even some of your athletes might even be sponsored by a particular company, then they need to be very careful. And guys, it is the athlete's responsibility. It's not the coach's responsibility. It's the athlete's responsibility. However, you as a coach are not allowed to recommend SIS or high five or whatever, because you would then be complicit if there was a problem. And I'm in the same. I can't say to X person, use this particular brand, because if they do and then there's a problem, I'm complicit. So I just throw that in. I don't want to dwell on that, but make your own shake and you know what's going in there. So you have your breakfast. We've got our breakfast. We go to the venue and we have our first game. So the breakfast needs to fuel that first game. It needs to be appropriate so that we can play the best that we possibly can. You finish that game. The athlete finishes that game. What do they do then? Well, they probably get a little coach debrief from one of you guys. Then they want to go to the loo. And then they start thinking about refueling. So I would say, whilst they're having the debrief, can they take some fluid in? Can they replace some fluid? Because the other part of nutrition is hydration. And keeping hydrated through the day is very important. However, many of our athletes don't want to drink too much because they're worried about constantly having to go to the loo. So the way around this, I think, is twofold. Firstly, practice. Know how much you can drink without being overloaded by, I've got to go to the loo, got to go to the loo. And secondly, when you're drinking water, and actually water in competition day is pretty much all you need, I would recommend you add a hydration tablet to that water. Now, this is known as an electrolyte tablet. And it's not a tablet like ibuprofen or paracetamol. It's just called a tablet because it's a little circular disc. And you can buy them from almost anywhere, Tesco's, any sports shop, anywhere. Now, by adding electrolytes to the water, not only does your body get sodium, potassium, and magnesium, which is what your body needs, it slows down the absorption into the bladder. So I find you can drink more without wanting to wee all of the time. So it's a nice little tip. Most people just do it when the weather's really hot, but I would say, do it all year round. And maybe not all of the water you drink in a day, but certainly 2 or 3 bottles of water that you've drunk, have it as a drink with electrolyte in. So that can help. So you can be drinking while you're getting your coach debrief, then nip off to the loo, get your loo in. Next thing you're focusing on, I need to fuel. Even if you're not hungry, you need to fuel at that point because you're thinking about the next game. So the same process again, a small meal which contains some protein and some carbohydrate. That's a simple rule. Let's keep it simple. Protein and carbohydrate. That will take you into your next game, and so you continue in that way. So throughout the competition day, I would recommend you only eat very small meals and you find out how much liquid you need to keep everything in balance. So this brings me to the venue, and I would seriously suggest as an athlete or as a coach, you recommend to your athlete they don't rely on venue food. The venue food that I've seen has been pretty poor in terms of quality, and often you get lunch which fills you up so much with stodge you can't perform in the afternoon because you hit a massive low. So this is where the daily management is important. The athlete taking responsibility for what the food they need, they like, and what's going to do the best for their body throughout the day. So take your own food to the venue is what I would say to athletes, and have what your body needs, and then you haven't got a problem there. So working through the day, it's small meals. At the end of the day, your first concern is, I'm thinking about tomorrow. It's a weekend competition. It's a 5-day competition. I'm thinking about tomorrow. So that evening meal, you probably eat quite a bit more than you have all day, and that's great. There's no problem there. You might even have a treat. That's when you have a dessert. But you're thinking about, am I getting A, the calories in, and B, the quality of calories to fuel me for the next day. So you're always thinking, as an athlete, I need to be ready for tomorrow morning. And then, of course, the day starts again. So after all that quite technical detail, and I hope I just haven't blown your mind with all that sort of stuff, I've tried to make it quite practical there, things that you can latch onto, and the sheet I've done should help you with this, but also to have a few key concepts that you can relate to. What I have found, and I'll stop talking now and let people come in, what I have found is that the approach to nutrition of, oh, you need to eat carrots, you need to eat bananas, you need to eat broccoli, doesn't work, because someone will come back and say, I hate broccoli, can't stand bananas, right? I hate wholemeal bread, I just can't abide. So you end up going in this silly circle of, well, what do you like then? Well, I don't like anything. So there it is. So you've got concepts and principles, and they choose within those frameworks what they like to eat. And then they might come back to you and say, what do you think of this? And then you can say, yes, well, that's a good food because. Okay. So one of the things I do when I'm working with athletes and I'm starting with them in this area, I always get them to do a food diary. 7 days of what they eat normally, without cheating, without trying to impress me, without trying to make things up. And then we sit down and we look at the week and we talk about what this does and what that does and how that could be improved. And then you're up and running and you're away. That's quite a nice, it's a very common way of working, but that's a nice way to find out what people are actually eating and how that puts together. So, shut up, Mr. Smith. Take a breath. And have we got anything people would like to ask and follow up on?
George has popped something in the chat about her daily smoothie recipe. She says she has fruit, spinach, coconut water, and is it kefir milk? I'm not familiar with that, but she's
kefir milk, yeah.
Yeah, she's asking, is that kind of too high in sugar? Would you say? Does that sound good?
Very good balance. Who was that? Sorry, was that
Georgina?
Georgina. No, very good balance, Georgina, that, because you've got that nice, and you've got lots of vitamins in there. So you've got lots of iron-rich foods like this, like the spinach, for example. Yes, I'm sorry, I saw things keep flashing up on the screen, but I'm not quick enough to read them and talk and do it well. So if there were any questions coming up, please forgive me for not answering. I just not quick enough to read them as they come up. So yes, Georgina, that's a good idea. So Georgina, do you like to have a smoothie instead of a solid meal breakfast? Is that when you have it?
No, I have it mid-afternoon, but for lunch all I have is like half a bowl of soup. I don't have a lot of lunch. So.
Okay, yeah. So you're thinking more in terms of the smaller meals, but yeah. So what you might try then is you can keep the smaller meals, but open up those gaps a little bit if that works for you as well. And if it doesn't work, then do what does work for you.
Okay, thanks.
That's the way to progress with that.
Okay.
Right and wrong is a difficult thing. It's very individual, but we're within certain principles.
Okay, thank you.
No, your pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
I was going to ask Bob, you might have partially answered it then about things being individual, but you sometimes hear things about eating breakfast at least an hour before you're going on court, and similar with other meals. Is there a recommendation for like that time lapse between eating and then going on to compete or perform, or is it very much down to each person?
Well, the basis for that kind of advice is that you're actually having quite a big meal. And you know yourself, if you have a big meal, then you don't want to go on court straight afterwards, or you don't want to go into a gym and training. But if you have a small meal and a meal where the food is very much absorbed, so if you've gone plant-based, for example, then you can exercise or play pretty soon after that meal. It takes that problem out. But if you went and had fish and chips, then you're done for 2 hours, really. You've got to let it digest for 2 hours. Otherwise, you just feel dreadful. So I think that's where that guideline comes from. But if you manage your day a little bit better, a bit like Georgina's trying to do there, then that makes it a big difference. Makes life a lot easier, actually. So I think daily management's important. Certainly in competition, management is important, and multiple day competition, it's very important as well. And then at the end of the competition, then you can have your celebration. Do it then. That's the time to do it.
For me, as a coach, one of the real potential problem areas, and I'm not going to say it is a problem, is when you're going away with a club or with an academy or even with England or it's parents and PAs that decide they're going to bring along a bag of food that contains all sorts of the sugar-based foods, and I'm a fine one to talk at the moment. And they're sort of dishing it out. You're as a coach, you're trying to give out that advice, and say you need to think about what you're eating. Just be aware, if you have a jacket potato with baked beans and cheese, at sort of 12 o'clock, and you've got a match at 1 o'clock, it's not going to be ideal. So you're trying to encourage athletes to, as you rightly said, Bob, do their own food, and then other sort of family members or parents of other athletes say, oh look, I've baked some muffins, let's all have a muffin, and you suddenly see all your athletes sitting around chomping on muffins, and you think, hang on. It's more of an observation than a question.
No, but that's exactly the situation we were in with previous people who have been on the team, and you just have to slowly try and wean that out and get people to realize that that's not what we need to do as an athlete. It's not the best for us, but it is difficult. And one thing I would say is that virtually every commercial energy bar or snack bar is an extremely high sugar bar. There are very few snack bars that are not extremely high in sugar. So they are a problem area, as are breakfast cereals. So your Cocoa Pops and your Sugar Puffs, and they're just loaded in sugar. So I guide my athletes away from those kind of choices and away from those cereal bars in particular. The type of bar that it's often described as a protein bar, not necessarily, because it's high in protein, but the protein bars, they tend to have more of a balance to them in terms of fat, carbohydrate, and protein, and therefore are more slowly absorbed. So the so-called protein bars, which you can buy at Tesco's and Asda and wherever, again, you can check them, and I'll come back to that question that came up about checking in a second. They tend to be better than the cereal bars. But yes, when people are coming in and think they're being really helpful and handing out the muffins, at some point we have to address it as a club and as a coach, and that's not the behaviour that we actually have. That question, there was a question came up about I take a certain type of shake. How do I check? If you go onto the UK anti-doping website, there's information there about how you check things. And in terms of things like medication and certain substances, there's a thing called global DRO. and you can type in whatever it is you're worried about, and it will tell you whether it's a banned substance or whether it's okay. And you can also check on that website, UKAD, what areas are batch tested and what companies are batch tested as well. So it's just a question of going online and doing that. And remember, it is the athlete's responsibility for that, because anybody can be tested anywhere, anytime. So just aware. You're welcome. That's great.
Thanks, Bob. There's another one in the chat about takeaways, which is a good question.
Right.
So is one takeaway a week acceptable if you're assuming that you're being good the rest of the week, or would you kind of say no processed food at all?
No, I mean, everybody, we all have to be realistic. And the thing I say to people is, look, forget being on a diet, forget the word diet. You have to have an eating management strategy that you're happy with for the rest of your life. So, you're not going to do it for 1 week or 2 weeks and then come off, and that's what most people do. They're on a diet for a week and then they can't stick it, so they come off. So yes, you've got to have a balance in what you do, and you're principally thinking about fueling your body for performance. But there'll be a little part of your eating that is to do with pleasure. There'll be another bit that's to do with convenience. And if you like an Indian takeaway, then yes, don't have them every day, because as we all know, they're extremely high in calories, mainly because the Indian restaurants cook with ghee, which is clarified butter, but they're lovely. So yes, have them once a week, have them once a fortnight, once a month. I don't know what the permitted time is because it's very individual, but just be careful that you're not constantly eating takeaways or getting Ubers or whatever they are delivered. Just as an aside, I do encourage people to take an interest in cooking, so that you actually know what goes into food. And if you're a baker and you bake a lot of cakes, you know exactly what goes into a cake. Right, 4 eggs, 250 grams of sugar, 250 grams of flour, etc., etc. You know that they have to be equal quantities, otherwise the cake doesn't work. So by getting involved in your own food, rather than buying food in or going to restaurants, not that we've been able to, have we, for ages, I think it's actually quite a good help. I know a couple of athletes, I have great conversations about cooking just because they're interested in it, and I enjoy cooking as well. So I use my fitness pal to go through. Yeah, that's good.
Another one from me, Bob. I just wondered, thinking of like BC3 athletes, for example, who are potentially on court for extended periods of time, would there ever be any need for those players to need to take on more than just water? Or, if you get things right pre-match, should you be okay for that 2 hours or whatever it might be?
Yes, you should. The golden rule is certainly with regard to fluid intake, you're actually probably okay for an hour. After an hour, you probably will need to take a sip of fluid, but it is often only a sip that you need, probably about 100 milliliters, so a good mouthful. And if you have fueled well, you shouldn't need to eat in up to a 2-hour game. You should be absolutely fine for that. If you do, it's probably more psychological than anything. I do see people taking gels, these gels, which are sugar gels, and it's probably not necessary. If it was a 3-hour game, then you like a tennis match, for example, you see the players, don't you, refueling between sets and things. That is probably important. Well, no, definitely important, but not in a boccia game lasting, let's say, an hour or an hour and a half, possibly up to 2 hours. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And then one just popped in from Lauren. She said, so lunch can often be difficult with a busy boccia schedule. So what are your recommendations for athletes, but also coaches and referees, which is a good point actually, about balancing it between getting a meal that fuels you, but without feeling too full to function?
Yeah. So on competition day, I wouldn't actually think in terms of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'd think of a series of smaller meals that are inserted at the appropriate time. And for a player, that will be usually after a game. For a coach or an athlete, a coach or one of the officials, it might be when they have their little gap. So you look at your strategy. You've got your own food in your knapsack, and you feed according to the timetable throughout the day, so that you know what you're getting. And that is the time to eat these smaller meals, which are packed with quality, but not in terms of, well, it's lunchtime, so I'll eat, but it's 10:30 and I've just finished that game, so I'll eat. That's the approach I would take to it. Is that okay, Lauren?
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, John. Another one from John. He's a wheelchair curler and often does 3 times 2-hour games in the cold, which seems to take up a lot of his energy that way. Any suggestions for him?
Yes, I mean, very, very similar there, John. But during that 2 hours in the cold, excuse me, you might consider certainly some fluid with electrolyte in. And it could be warm fluid as well. It doesn't have to be cold fluid. It could be warm fluid, which really helps. And in that fluid, there could be some calories. So let's say there was some milk in there. You'd be getting some calories from the milk. You'd be getting some protein from the milk. So with cold, it's a good idea to have warm fluid going in, not cold fluid, because that only makes things worse. And a 2-hour game, you're getting to the point there where it will be better to have something early on in that 2 hours to get you going through the end. And as soon as you come off the ice, then make sure you feed and you hydrate at that point as well. Thank you, John. I did a talk for a group of people. It was a charity. Was it British? I think it was a heart charity, and their volunteers were on all day, monitoring these events that they put on. I think, it's a Race for Life. That was it. And we had a really interesting conversation as to what they could pack to fuel them through the day. So that's in the knapsack, because they just didn't have any time. They were rushed off their feet. But if you've got something there in your bum bag, even when you're directing traffic or whatever you're doing, you can pop your hand in and pull out a boiled egg or whatever you've got in there. And I know some of you may know my sport for many, many years, 30 odd years, was triathlon. And I did the long distance Ironman triathlon, which lasts, let's say for me, 10 hours. Well, you have to learn how to feed on the move and have appropriate feed throughout that 10 hours. Otherwise, you just don't finish the event. So being creative with what you can have is really quite useful. And I used to have on the bike effectively little jacket potatoes, although they were little ones, bite size. I'd roast them beforehand and just have them in a bit of foil, and they went down really well because it was real food. Some other people I knew used to just live on gels all day, and halfway through the marathon run, all those gels would come back again. People would be very ill in the run. But those of us who were on solid foods had a more normality to our diet, and we could finish the run strongly and hopefully do well. So it's getting interested and getting involved and seeing what works, and that's, I think, the same for every athlete.
I like that little roast potato tip. I'll have to try that one when I'm on a run, maybe.
On your busy weekends, roast potato in foil, but they're tiny. A boiled egg in foil, which has already got your salt and pepper on for taste in the foil. You just open the foil, in goes the egg. It's really, really nice. Tiny little sandwiches, bite-sized sandwiches, not huge, great sandwiches, just little bite-sized, wrapped up in a little bit of whatever to protect it. In it goes, and then away you go. It's surprising how little food you need to get you through. I'll just give you one quick example. Time's running on, but in terms of carbohydrate, you can actually only absorb about 50 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And that's the equivalent of a banana. So when you are eating, don't think you have to eat masses to have the energy to survive. Actually, quite a small amount of food can give you what you need for, as I say, an hour. And 50 grams of carbohydrate, wherever that comes from, will do the job for you. And you won't even know you've eaten that but it will give you the energy that you need.
There's a couple more that have just come in, Bob, if we cover these and then we'll let you go. Lauren's asked about non-dairy milk. So are they more or less calorific as regular? And would this make any difference when you're thinking about making up smoothies and shakes and things?
It won't make any difference. The calories just come from plant-based. So almond milk, for example, is a really good source of protein, rich in vitamins and minerals. Soya milk, very similar. So it wouldn't be a concern for me. I'd certainly use them. Yeah, they're very good these days. Coconut milk's another good one. Slightly more calories there, but it won't make a huge amount of difference. Just have a little bit less, perhaps. Yeah.
And one final one from Gemma then. She's asked something interesting, actually, potentially quite a sensitive one, but about supporting an athlete with an eating disorder.
Right. Okay. In many ways, that's a whole topic area. I used to coach. I've coached a number of female athletes, and I have got experience of this. And in fact, I used to do some work for the Nutrition Society, helping female athletes with eating disorders. I think the best advice is to get professional advice, and to work with a professional on this, because it's a very complex area. And the reason for the eating disorder, the reasons are often many-fold. It can be body image, it can be mental health, or what have you. So I think as a coach, and we're all, let's say, Boccia coaches, or even in my case, it might be outside your realm, your scope of expertise. Be supportive, don't be judgmental, but recommend that professional advice is sought. I think that's the best advice I could give. Is that okay, Gemma? But a lovely question, and it's a whole. In fact, we the Boccia, the Great Britain Boccia team had a webinar not long ago on female athlete health, and that was put on by the EIS, and that was very informative on that kind of stuff. I think our athletes found it very useful. So there is help available on that subject.
Great. Thanks, Bob. I think we've covered everything that's come through in the chat now. If anyone else wants to unmute and shout anything else out, no problem before we go. But that was really useful. Thank you, Bob. Really interesting.
You're welcome. And just have a look at the sheet that's going to come your way and work through it. And I think you'll find that it will prompt you nicely, and you can make your own notes. So obviously, things that you wanted to remember, perhaps, or wanted to follow up on, you'll be able to hopefully be able to do that. It's only one sheet. It's not a War and Peace or anything like that.
Hopefully we'll all cross paths at a competition sometime in the future, and we can sneak a peek at what everybody's eating and what little culinary delights you've prepared. We'll be thinking back to this session, hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I'll follow up with another email, as Bob said, and hopefully see you at another one of these sessions sometime soon as well.